All righty. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me and see me okay? All right.
Yep.
Great. Emily, Katie, Millie, Nina, good to have you here this week. Poor Emily, she had something disrupt her from attending class. She logged on yesterday and was there for a couple minutes and then had to go. So Emily, glad you gave it another try and are here with us today. All righty, let's see. Yeah, so Millie was taking a look at that recipe for this week, which I'll just go ahead and pull up right now. Let's see. Yeah, making the very astute comment that sure, you could absolutely substitute tortellini in this recipe, and it could be suppose it could be either frozen or refrigerated tortellini. A lot of those raviolis and tortellinis come refrigerated. So you could probably use, do either of those and just maybe cut back on the cooking time since you're not cooking it from frozen. But yeah, that would give you a lot more options for sure. If you open it up to all refrigerated or frozen ravioli or tortellini. So good thought. So yeah, I chose this recipe this week because it's back to school time. I don't know who that is affecting here, if anybody. Is this affecting anybody here? I know it's affecting Emily because she said so yesterday. Yeah, anybody else? What about back to UK? Like, does that students coming back to UK, does that affect anybody's workflow or schedule in the next few weeks? Millie, okay, just more, traveling back and forth. Okay. So yeah, this tends to be a busy time. Oh, Katie's an empty nester. Oh, that's crazy. Yeah, my daughter's starting high school next year. So yeah, I feel like I'm getting too close to that time for myself of being an empty nest. I have a son now. He's a few years behind. So yeah. Oh, okay. So this is a busy time of year. Kids are going back to school in Fayette County next week. Some kids already have gone back, depending on where they live. Things are shaken up at UK with, the semester getting started underway. So this time of year, I'm always looking for, super duper simple dinners. Now, you guys already know I'm pretty lazy in the kitchen and my recipes are usually pretty easy and efficient and straightforward. But this one really takes the cake in terms of lazy and efficient. And this is the kind of thing I do make when times are really crazy and I need to be sure I have something around that I can literally dump and bake. Okay. Yeah, so this is not, again, maybe you've done something similar to this. This is not, again, groundbreaking stuff here, but it does get the job done. And it can be, a balanced meal. All right. The marinara sauce I chose, well, let me back up. The stuff we love this week is a marinara sauce that I chose to highlight how you can try to find a healthier jarred marinara, right? Because I know a lot of people are like, well, isn't that stuff, high in sodium and high in sugar? And it is easy to make your own. Now, again, I don't do it because I just don't prioritize that. And a lot of people probably don't. So you're probably buying a jarred marinara sauce. And I highlighted the Kroger no sugar added one because from a sugar and sodium perspective, it is really good. It's about as good as you're going to get. Now it still has, I think, about 360 milligrams of sodium per serving, which is, again, still a little high because the serving is only like a half cup, but a lot of the other ones are well into the 400s in terms of sodium. So that's what I mean about just doing the best you can with the options that you have. But that's a decent one. It only costs $1.69, you guys. It's cheap, right? Whatever cheese you want, mozzarella tends to work well, but you could get, an Italian blend or provolone. This recipe is even more complicated than what I do. This recipe is just kind of layering things. But I just literally dump it all in a 9x13 pan, the ravioli, the sauce, and the mozzarella. I stir it all up, I cover it with foil, and I bake it. That's simple. I like the notes down here, though. This recipe had some ideas. You could add some extra veggies, like put some spinach in there. Spinach is a great thing that just kind of disappears into the dish. Once it's cooked, nobody knows it's there, and you're getting those veggies. You could put some maybe Italian veggies in there, a frozen Italian veggie mix, some zucchini, things like that. Any kind of shredded veggie would probably work really well too. And you can certainly up the protein if you're concerned about that. If you want to add some cooked ground beef or turkey or chicken, those would all work well. If you don't want a 9x13, if you're not going to eat all that, you could do cut it in half and do an 8-inch square pan, or do 2 8-inch square pans and freeze one for later so that you have an easy frozen meal down the road. All right. Any thoughts, questions? Anybody ever make anything like this before? Lee and Angela, it's good to have you guys here. Got a good little group today. Emily, you've made something like this? Yeah. Okay. All right. Oh, fancy, Katie. Oh, Millie's going to try it tonight. Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing about this recipe. It must be endlessly, customizable in terms of, the regular tortellini you use, the sauce, the veggies, the proteins. I mean, you could probably even use a white kind of sauce. Now, again, that might increase the fat a little bit and all that, but certainly that would be an option. Yeah. All right. Okay, so let's transition to our topic for today, willpower. It has been a long time since we've done this topic, and I just want to explain that I don't know, I started having some doubts about whether covering willpower in the way that we used to was really helpful for people. I wasn't sure that it was. And I took a break from it for a while. And then I started to see some, articles and kind of newer research about, kind of a different understanding of willpower and maybe a different way to talk about it that might be more empowering and helpful for people to understand. So once I started seeing some of that, I thought, let's take another stab at willpower and see how it goes, because this is a word we use a lot. Would you guys agree? Willpower? I mean, when it comes to food and eating and behavior change, I hear a lot of people using that word. Well, if I just had enough willpower, or I don't have any willpower. I mean, we say things like this all the time, right? But do we really know what we're talking about? Do we really understand what willpower is? Okay. So that's what I want to talk about today. Are there other words that come to mind when you hear the word willpower? Synonyms? How else would you describe willpower? Discipline. Yep. Good one, Angela. Determination. Yep. Emily. Control is another common one. Drive. Okay. Sometimes people even describe it as motivation, although those are two separate things, which we should talk about separately another time, motivation. But yeah, you guys kind of generally have a sense of what it is, right? Or a certain connotation when you hear that word. And a lot of times, I think we think it's this kind of magical, mystical power that we either have or we don't. And we don't really understand why we feel like we have more of it sometimes and less of it other times. And sometimes too, again, based on this kind of older thinking of willpower, we kind of feel like, well, we're either good at willpower and someone who has it, or we're not. And we're just kind of screwed if we don't. And I think that was the part of discussing willpower that I was not comfortable with, and why I kind of abandoned it for a little while, because I'm like, well, if that's kind of the way that we're thinking about willpower, that's not very helpful to people. But the good news is that's not true. Okay. And that's what I want to talk more about right now. So a few ways we can describe willpower. One is in the blue there, capacity to engage in behaviors consistent with your intentions. Now, chances are, right, we're kind of doing this all the time, whether it's with food or exercise, or even, again, parenting, finances, what have you, any area of your life, right? Chances are you have intentions about how you'd like to behave. Okay. And you want to engage in behaviors that are consistent with that. And often our feelings of frustration or failure come from not acting in a way, behaving in a way, making choices, right, that are consistent with those intentions, right? That's where the discord kind of comes from. So yeah, willpower is pretty easy to understand when we use that definition. Another definition I like that I've seen that I didn't put on here, it's along these lines. It's talking about the ability to delay short-term gratification to meet long-term goals. And you can see how that plays along with this definition in the blue. You can use goals and intentions kind of interchangeably. But thinking about it more, it's like a short-term, long-term kind of challenge, right? That there's something here, the shiny thing right now that maybe we want to do, but maybe it's not consistent with this longer term goal, right? And that is really where the challenge comes into play, all right? It's also could be described as the ability to inhibit a response to a temptation. So again, meaning you have this shiny thing, this temptation, whether it's, something, there to eat that you did not intend to eat. Maybe it's, boy, it's really tempting to sit on the couch and watch Netflix now instead of doing my workout, whatever the temptation is, okay? It's the ability to just kind of override the impulse to give into that temptation, all right? So in that moment, being able to override it. It's also an ability to adapt when circumstances change. I find this one really interesting because again, aren't we always striving to be better at that, right? Just again, kind of like maybe you make a budget and you overspend on your budget and then you find ways to adapt, right? And get your budget back on track. Kind of like that with, we can think about that with, our well-being, right? Maybe you've been trying to bring your lunch to work and then one day you forget your lunch. So now what do? Do you just throw all the intentions out the window, or do you find a way to adapt so that you can still try to engage in a behavior that's fairly consistent with that intention? Instead of maybe saying, oh, well, screw it, I forgot my lunch, I'll go get some burger and fries. Maybe you can say, all right, let me see what's available to me that might be a fairly healthy choice and resembles what I would have brought from home. Okay, so it's that ability to adapt. And it's also an ability to think about the consequences of our actions, right? Being able, again, in that moment where you're trying to override that impulse to the temptation, being able to, step outside of that immediate moment and think about, all right, how is this going to play out afterwards if I do or do not follow through? Okay. Maybe how will I feel physically or emotionally about what I did, right? How will this affect other choices that I'm going to make, all right? So being able to think about that longer term and get outside of the immediate moment of temptation. Any thoughts on those? Anything you might add to a description or definition of willpower? I think willpower doesn't seem so magical and mystical after you use these definitions. I hope you guys agree with that, right? It's a lot easier to understand now, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So a few things we understand now and know about willpower. And again, this, like a lot of things, it kind of changes over time based on the research and our understanding and interpretation of it. Okay. So I sense that this is still, a bit of a fluid thing, like a lot of things in science and psychology. But I think the newer understanding of willpower is that it's really just a form of decision making, right? And all those definitions we just used, I think, support that. Okay. It's just a way of making decisions. All right. And it's particularly a way of making decisions in light of a temptation or unwanted impulse that we have to manage and work through. Okay. It's also, this is very interesting, a conflict between what they call our hot and cool systems. Okay. I like to think of this as okay, you know, in those little like cartoons, and they put like a little angel and a devil on the person's shoulders, and they're like, oh, you should do this, no, you should do that, right? I think that's really the best way to describe this, where you could think of, again, without the morality of a devil and an angel, right? Take that out of it. But you get the devil, which is kind of like the impulsive, emotional, again, hot system, right? That's how they describe the hot system. It's emotional, it's impulsive, it's like, oh, there's the shiny thing, that's the thing we want, right? And then you got on the other side the angel, which I guess you could say is the cool system, where it's more of that kind of cognitive thinking system, where it's reasoning, analysis, decision making, the ability to think about long-term implications, right? And these are also using different parts of your brain, by the way, right? But there's a conflict between that hot and cool system, and your goal in that moment is to really allow the cool system to override the hot system. Okay. Lori, welcome. Good to have you here. The thing that had once bothered me also in the discussion about willpower was that it was talked about as a finite, I guess, psychological resource, that you only had so much of it in a day, okay, for example. And that once you run out of it, again, you're kind of screwed. Well, what do you do? And that's not very empowering to people, right? Like, oh, just it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of like, oh, I've run out of willpower, so I'm just gonna make these decisions now that I'm going to maybe regret later. Oh, no problem, Lori. I'm glad you could hop on and join us. So it is not a finite resource. A better way to look at it is really as an emotion, which I find interesting. And you don't run out of emotions, really. I mean, you don't run out of joy or anger or fear or jealousy or any of those emotions, right? And they kind of ebb and flow, right? All emotions do that. And willpower does that too, right? That's kind of that feeling I think people describe of like, well, sometimes I have it and sometimes I don't. And again, that's a very complicated process of why certain emotions come to the surface, when they do, why they ebb and why they flow. But I think it's more helpful to think about willpower that way, as an emotion. Okay. The empowering thing about that too is that if we label it as an emotion and think about it as something that ebbs and flows, we can learn to ride it out. Right. So when we're in this moment of feeling like we are struggling, okay, to override that hot system with the cool system, right? Because we're waiting for that willpower to kick in. Maybe we can ride it out, right? Knowing that it's coming and going, that willpower. And then finally, another interesting way to think about it is that it has 3 elements. We often only think about the first one, I won't. That is often people's, first impression of willpower. It's the thing I'm not going to do, right? I'm not going to eat the cupcake. I'm not going to skip my workout. Whatever. It's very, I don't know, it's kind of a negative orientation, really. But it is part of it, right? You got to identify the thing you're trying not to do, but it also is the thing you will do, right? Thinking about, okay, well, I'm not going to do that. What will I do? And it's also thinking about, I want. Thinking about what is it that you really want to do? What is personally meaningful for you? Okay. And why is this important that you don't do this thing, but will do this thing, right? What is the want, right? Why is this important for you? And being connected with that is also very important. Okay. Any other thoughts on these? The next page, we're going to move on to some strategies you can use to put this information into some action. Okay. Okay. So, like I just mentioned, right? We want to focus on, the want to, and setting want to intentions instead of have to intentions, right? Or goals, whatever words you want to use there. But so often, right, we hear people saying, and maybe, some of us do this, saying, oh, I have to go to the gym or I have to eat more vegetables, and well, that doesn't really come from a place of personal empowerment or, connecting with, something that's personally meaningful for you. It just sounds like a directive, right? That came from outside of you. And a lot of times it does. People are just, taking something maybe their doctor said, or a, family member, or friend, or coworker said, or something they got off social media, and just thinking, oh, well, I have to do this because so-and-so told me to, or everybody else is doing this, or whatever, right? And if that's how you're going to go about setting intentions and goals, chances are you're not going to be that successful, right? Because what is your personal connection to that? If it's not that important to you to eat more vegetables, if you don't have a real driving kind of why, then you're not going to do it. Maybe you'll do it for a little while. Okay. So really thinking about what you want, right? Why are setting these intentions or goals important for you? All right. The big why. And we talk about that sometimes, right? Looking at that big why. Why am I doing any of this? All right. And for a lot of people, it comes down to quality of life issues, right? Maybe I want to be able to be around to see my grandkids. Maybe I want to be able to get off some of these medications that give me these side effects I don't like. Maybe I want to be able to go up and down the stairs with, out getting out of breath. Maybe I just want to have more energy, right? So thinking about why any of what you're doing is meaningful for you. And if you've realized like maybe it's not meaningful for you, well, maybe it's something to stop pursuing, at least for now. Okay. Also, like I mentioned, focusing on the I will instead of the I won't. Again, part of, sure, willpower is resisting a temptation and being clear about what that temptation is that you don't want to follow through with. But again, taking it one step further and being able to say, all right, well, I will do this instead. And again, that's part of that empowerment that I always felt was lacking from willpower. So, it is called willpower, right? So we're bringing the will back. What will you do? All right. Okay, I won't sit here and watch Netflix for 3 hours, but I will do what instead? Maybe I'll go take a walk around the block. Maybe I will go to the gym. Maybe I'll do some stretching. Okay. Maybe I'll use that time to prepare some food. Okay. So thinking about it a little bit more proactively about what you will do now. This is an interesting one. And we've talked about this, about, engineering your environment and all of that in a way that makes the good choice the easy choice. That's often how I describe it. So structuring your habits so that you don't have to rely on willpower. The really interesting thing about some of the research coming out about willpower is that the people who seem to exhibit the most self-control are actually using the least of it. Now, how does that make sense, you wonder? It's because they're not testing themselves. They're not putting themselves in situations where they have to test that willpower. For example, maybe they have chips or candy or whatever things in the house, right? But they're not keeping it maybe out on the counter where it's easy to see. And every time they see it, they're going to have to wrangle with, do I have some chips or candy, right? If it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And it's one less decision they have to make and rely on willpower, okay? Maybe they bring their gym clothes with them to work so that they can have them on and ready to go on their way home and go to the gym then. Okay. So they're structuring their schedule, their habits, their environment in a way that promotes the kinds of choices they want to make, makes it easier to behave in a way consistent with their intentions, right? And that's the definition we started with. Okay. You guys have any examples of how you maybe do that in your day-to-day lives? Trying to make the good choice the easy choice. That's really the key. Because the odds are, the more you have to rely on the willpower, right? The more opportunity you have to make that choice you're not going to feel good about. Oh, Emily, I like that. That's very good. Yes. I know, right? Isn't it crazy how you can just, kind of feel yourself getting into that ball of stress and anxiety and worry, and what some good breathing, even momentarily, can do. It's really amazing. Let's see. This lesson is really helpful. Want instead of have to. Oh, like the blog post this week, train your brain. I'm going to talk about more about that in a minute. Oh, I tried it yesterday and it worked. It got me past the sugar craving after lunch. Well, thanks for sharing that, Katie. And I love that you were so, I don't know, open to trying it. I mean, I think that's what's awesome. You are open to even trying it, and that's great. Yeah, well done. Yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit more about that though, that breathing, meditation. Yeah. So bringing more awareness to your everyday choices. Now, this is easier said than done. We could probably do a whole lesson on this. I'm going to ask you guys a quiz question. How many food-related choices do you think you make in a day? How many? Yeah. Emily, okay. Emily, you overshot a little bit, but maybe you feel like you do. I'm not going to, question that. Okay, so we got 100 to 6,000. All right, so, oh, Angela, if I had a prize, I'd give it to you. I guess you're the closest, right? Although if we're playing like, what is that show? Price is Right, you would lose because you're over. But 227. They've actually tried to quantify this through research. 227 food-related choices a day. But it's funny. I mean, you guys are savvy, but when they ask, people, right, Katie? When they ask people how many choices they think they make, the average person who's not really thinking about nutrition said like, 7 or something, which kind of makes sense. They're probably thinking, well, I just think about, what I'm going to eat, breakfast, lunch, and dinner and snacks or something. It seems very uncomplicated to them especially if you're not thinking about food like we do here, perhaps. 227 food choices. Now, I don't say that to be demoralizing. I really say that to be, understanding that we're not actively making all 227 of those food choices every day. We can't be. We don't have the mental capacity to do that. All right. So the majority of those 227 food choices are really happening on autopilot. I mean, they're choices we're making where there is an alternative choice, but we're just on autopilot making that choice maybe we've always made, or the one that's easy, the one that's comfortable, the one we know. Okay, so that's the idea. So if you can bring awareness to the choices that are being made, even when they're ones that are on autopilot, then you have more opportunity to intervene and make a different choice. But you can't change what you're not aware of, right? That's the whole point. It would be interesting to see man versus woman who's stereotypically in charge of food for way more than just herself. That's a great point, right? That would be interesting. Yeah, like whoever in the house is responsible for the shopping and cooking and preparing school lunches for kids or whatever, yeah, their actual decision making must be much higher than 227. That's funny. And that's a real thing. I mean, I think you're probably right that in my experience, women more likely than not are the person, kind of the gatekeeper of food in the house, and making those kinds of choices. And it can be a real pressure. Like I hear a lot of people talk about that. So I don't know if any women here feel that way, but it can feel like a real responsibility and pressure. And it's just can get to a point where you feel like, you're responsible for everybody's health in your family, by the food that you're serving them. And that can feel like a lot of pressure and responsibility, and that gets to people sometimes. So that's a real thing. Practice self-compassion when you experience setbacks. Okay. So, the cool system does not always win over the hot system, right? The goal is to have that happen, but it's impossible for that to always happen. So sometimes that hot system, that little devil on your shoulder is going to win. Okay. And you're going to do the thing you didn't intend to do. And that's not, in line with your long-term goals. Okay, fine. What do we do when that happens typically, right? We get mad at ourselves. We berate ourselves. We are very critical of ourselves. All right. And when we think that's the answer, we think that, okay, well, now I got to pull out the, as I call it, inner drill sergeant. What is wrong with you? Get down, give me 20, right? We have to, make up for it and double down and try even harder next time, right? That kind of thing. But really what we know now is that self-compassion is what gets us through those setbacks more successfully. And let me give you an example from the research. They had, they invited women to a lab to come eat donuts. I want to be a part of that study, right? So anyway, they divided the women into two groups, and both groups were given donuts and said, all right, here's donuts, have as much as you want, whatever, for this certain period of time. After the donuts, half the women were just, left alone there. And the other half of the women were, the researchers went in and gave them kind of messages of self-compassion. I think they maybe gave them like little notes or something like that that said things like, everybody messes up sometimes, and, be gentle on yourself, and it's okay, right? These, again, self-kindness kind of messages. So after they did that, both groups were then presented with candy. So now they are said, brought candy in, and they said, all right, have however much candy you want. The group that did not get the self-compassion messages ate more than double the amount of candy that the women who got the self-compassion messages did. Which means, right, again, if we're going to make a conclusion from that, and the researchers did, means that self-compassion, after having that lapse, right, that setback, is actually productive in helping people navigate the next challenge that comes along. All right, you're more successful in navigating that than the people who didn't get that self-compassion message. All right, so I think that's a really powerful example. And again, it sounds counterintuitive to how we're used to operating, but I encourage you to give it a try. And then finally, using meditation to strengthen the neural pathways that support willpower. And yes, that was the blog post Katie was referring to. If you haven't read it, I'd encourage you to. But I'm personally fascinated by the kind of neuroanatomy of the brain and of willpower. We have something called a prefrontal cortex, and that is where a lot of this rational decision making and all of that supports willpower, that's where that originates. And yeah, a lot of the newer research is showing that we can actually change our brains, okay, with certain activities and habits and practices, all right? And meditation is actually one of the best ways to strengthen that prefrontal cortex. You can actually create new connections between the neurons and new neural pathways so that they're easier to use and more accessible. They're stronger, more accessible when you need them. That's the idea, okay? And there was an example on there, like a 5-minute meditation, because meditation does not need to be like, an hour-long thing where you're sitting on your yoga mat and, whatever. You can do it in just a couple minutes. And it's really just, kind of like Emily was talking about, trying to just bring attention to your breath and really just kind of be still. But that's hard for us. That's the thing. Even that 5-minute meditation, Katie, right? That was probably hard yesterday for you to just really be able to try to sit there and just, I don't know, you're just trying to make your mind kind of go blank, and just not think about anything. That's really hard, right? But that is what, that meditation helps you do, and that strengthens that neural pathway, right? Of that self-control in the brain. Emily, it takes a while for your brain to associate new patterns with dopamine. Oh, that's like the feel-good neurotransmitter, right? So when you're first starting, it's really hard because doing the things you're trying to change give us a dopamine shot. Oh, that's very interesting. So we actually are we're so used to getting a reward, I guess you're saying, from the thing we usually do, that when we're trying to change it.
That's, I was, you were reading out loud, I was like, I don't think that I articulated that well. So like, if I wanted to learn how to play football instead of soccer, playing soccer gives me a dopamine shot, whereas playing football doesn't. So I have to keep playing football to teach my brain to give me the dopamine shot to play football instead of soccer.
Thank you for that. Yes. Okay. That is a really good analogy. Absolutely. So I guess, yeah. And that's why, it does feel uncomfortable to do at first and kind of unnatural. And maybe that's part of it, is that you're just not getting like a reward from it like you would from whatever other activity you would prefer to do, right? So just, yeah, I guess that patience And practice is really what's key. And there was some statistics in there about, after it doesn't take that long to start to see some results. So I think that's the encouraging part, that doing it, consistently enough for not terribly long periods of time actually does start to, change, how you're behaving and how, your brain is changing as well. All right. Okay, good discussion today too, guys. I appreciate that. Any other thoughts? I feel like maybe this really hit a chord with people. So I'm glad I brought this back then, this topic. Oh, thanks, Katie. Okay, I'm gonna click on that when we're done and take a look. Ooh, yeah, that's kind of like a upgraded version of upscale version of what I have there on the recipe. Very nice. Yeah, and just as easy, sounds like. Thank you. All right. Yeah. Anyone who's here, be sure, if you're interested in that, click on the link so you have it. All right. Well, I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Next week, we are going to be talking about something called component cooking. I noticed that, some more cooking things were on the feedback you guys had given. I don't know anyone here in particular if that was your feedback, but there seemed to be a theme that you'd like to hear more about, kind of different cooking techniques. So I'm going to talk about component cooking next week, which is the idea that instead of preparing recipes per se and different dishes every night, you prepare a bunch of different components at the beginning of the week and then mix and match them into different meals throughout the week. So we're going to talk about that. All righty. Thanks, Nina. You guys have a great rest of your week and take care. All right. Bye.